Okay, good afternoon, everyone. So, this is the title of my talk is A Greener Earth with a question mark. And this is work done by a visiting scholar from PRC at Boston University, Jai Churn. My name is Myneni. I will present, my talk is quite brief, so hopefully we'll have time for some questions and answers. So I will talk about analysis of a new NDVI data set from AVHRR sensors. And the data set is 31 and a half years long. And most of the analysis I've done is for about 31 years, I believe. And it's a spatial-temporal data set. The spatial resolution is 8 by 8 kilometers square. And we have 2 global views a month. And the data set was generated about 2 years back. And they're still working on it and generating it by Drs. Jorge Pinzon and Jim Tucker. And the data set has been distributed to people who expressed an interest in checking the data set out. So there's a special issue of the open source journal, Remote Sensing. And as of today, 25 papers have been published. There are 8 more in process. So if you are interested in this data set and the work and the value of this data set, you can check this special issue out. So the variable I'll be using for my analysis is the Growing Season Integrated Vegetation Index, NDVI. Growing Season Integrated VI. And therefore, I need to start with a definition of the growing season. And so we have used NDVI thresholds to define the start and end of the growing season globally, pixel by pixel. And because the land surface could be green in the winters and there is no photosynthesis happening, and to capture that, we also use the climatology from another 30-year data set from massive microwave sensors, the climatology of it, and in order to see if the ground is frozen or thawed. And if the ground is thawed, then we assume photosynthesis is happening. These 2 color panels, the one on the left shows the starting day number, and the color panel on the right shows the growing season duration. Obvious patterns, nothing special here. It is, of course, calculated carefully enough. We find that 96% of the pixels have 1 growing season per year, and year being a period of 12 consecutive months, and about 25% have a growing season that spans 2 calendar years. So, having defined the growing season at the pixel scale, we simply integrate the NDVI during that period, and we obtain 1 number per year per pixel, which is the growing season integrated vegetation index. And we need to understand what this represents. It's after all a radiometric quantity. And therefore here I show a figure that compares the growing season integrated vegetation index with gross primary productivity derived by Beer et al. And for different IGBP vegetation types for the period 1998 to 2005. So the GPP itself is it is a gridded data set, but it was derived from flux power measurements and ancillary data with machine learning tools. And the ancillary data, I believe, could be could be satellite data also. Not necessarily the same NDVI data, but other satellite data. So this relationship could be spurious. I show in this figure another comparison between the growing season integrated vegetation index and gross primary productivity, this time for different ecoregions of the world based on work by Olson. Again for the period 98 to 2005. This figure together with the previous figure gives us some indication that the variable we are working with, the growing season integrated vegetation index, is not only a mouthful, but is a surrogate of gross primary production. So from now on, allow me to use GSI-VI. So we have 30 years, a pixel scale, this data set. So we use the Vogelsong method. It's a reasonably powerful statistical method, and to see statistically significant changes over this 30-year period. So I'll be saying greening, by which I mean a statistically significant increase over this 30-year period in growing season integrated vegetation index, and I will use browning to mean a statistically significant decrease in GSI-VI over this period, and the level of significance we have chosen is 10%, which is arbitrary, but so be it. And this color-coded global figure shows the magnitude of the trend for greening and browning pixels. It is, to my mind, an astounding figure that Jai-Chun has put together, done reasonably carefully, and it seems as if an invisible hand has been cultivating our planet for the last 30 years. You can hardly see any areas where there is browning. In this figure, it should appear as red colors, hardly difficult to see. Nearly on all continents, there is this greening. So, from that color figure, we infer that 31% of the global vegetated area greened, and this greening translates to a 14% increase in gross productivity. And the table here shows these numbers from that color figure and by vegetation type, IGBP vegetation type. And you see that the greening is seen in all vegetation types. So we repeated this calculation, this time using a different statistical method, the Mann-Kendall test. And this method gives us nearly identical patterns of greening and browning. And that gives us some confidence that the results are independent of the statistical method we have used. There is quite a bit of analysis that we have since done, thanks to feedback from Shailong PR, he's somewhere here, but I'm not going to present that. But that analysis, based on prodding from Shailong, pointed to some problems, but I will not mention them here. So, here we aggregate the greening trends and show them as a time series for forests, other woody vegetation, herbaceous vegetation, croplands / natural vegetation mosaics. And we see that the greening trend in these four broad categories of vegetation is about 2.8% to 5.1% per decade. So if you accept from what I have presented thus far that we do detect a significant greening of our planet over the last 30 years, this begs the question, why did our planet green? So 30 years is not a short period, neither is it sufficiently long to robustly infer the kind of changes I'm talking about. But anyway, I will attempt to present a simple attribution or a reason for the greening of the planet. We have to start somewhere. So I will assume that the climatic control of plant growth is expressed via precipitation, water availability, temperature, the heating, and solar radiation, as in photosynthetically active radiation available for plant growth. So every location, vegetated location on our planet can be divided into a location which is limited only by water, only by radiation, only by temperature, or combination of these two variables, such as water and radiation, water and temperature, radiation and temperature, and finally a location that is limited by all three variables. Okay, so every vegetated location or pixel we can say belongs to one of these 7 cases. Let me take the simplest case, which is a location that is limited only by water. So the greening of a location where vegetation growth is limited only by the availability of water can be attributed to the case of a relaxation of climatic constraint if there is a statistically significant increasing trend in precipitation over the past 30 years. Otherwise, the greening of in that location has to be attributed to some other factor which we shall lump into something called anthropogenic impacts. So we can work through all these 7 cases. It's kind of tedious. I've shown here another example where you have a location where water and temperature are limiting plant growth, and we can work through the various scenarios and attribute them to relaxation of climatic constraints, unknown, or anthropogenic effects, and so on and so forth. This can be done, it's quite straightforward. So in this figure, this is a color-coded figure showing the attribution. So, for instance, 5.2% of the greening that we have seen can be attributed to the case of increased availability of water. And you can read the numbers about all these 7 cases. You add them up, you come up with this statement, which is 42% of the observed greening can be attributed to relaxation of climatic constraints. I had hoped that this would be something like 90%. So then we could have stopped this analysis. It turns out this is a small number. Actually, 57% of the greening that we are seeing cannot be explained in terms of observed variations in climate. So, what could these reasons be if it is not climate? It could be CO2 fertilization. It's convenient to think that way because we see this everywhere in all vegetation types and all the 7 continents. But there is no, reading from literature and talking to Philipsia, there is no information in the literature which you could use to build a case arguing for climate CO2 fertilization. The few long-term experiments that we have, maybe there are 3 or 4, the results, the Duke experiment, which is a decade long, it shows an increase in NPP with the enhanced CO2 concentration. The ORNL experiment, that's also a decade long, It shows an initial enhancement, and since then, in the last 6 or 7 years, that actually the NPP has gone down. So there are no real believable results in the literature which point to the fertilization effect. In any case, over the 30 years, CO2 increased by maybe 50 ppm. Is that enough to cause a stimulation of plant growth to the extent that we would see it as we see it in the satellite data? I do not know. Well, there is the other, could be nitrogen deposition, but there are no spatiotemporal data sets of nitrogen deposition. Enhanced nutrient availability. Pep Canadell talks about woody encroachment. Philippe Yard talked about aging of the forest, which I think all of these are very valid candidates. Regrowth from past disturbances and returning forests and abandoned land. So obviously this is not going anywhere. So I'm just itemizing a list of potential candidates, and you can't publish opinions and what your friends say. So we leave it up to some clever young people to continue this discussion. So the conclusions are that the growing season integrated vegetation index seems to be a reasonable surrogate for GPP. So it alleviates the problems of having to model GPP, because then you would have to bring in a model, climate data, etc., efficiency, and so on. So we can directly work with a measured quantity. And the statistics that we have done suggest that a third of the global vegetated area has greened over the past 30 years, and this translates to an increase in 30% in GPP. And the greening is seen in all vegetation types. The analysis that I've alluded to, and which I said I'm not showing, actually, the conclusion of that analysis is that the greening trend, which I presented, actually depends on the length of the data record, and that is very disturbing. So even the detection that I presented here has some troubles. So we have to go back and tighten that up. And the attribution analysis that I presented suggests that a large portion of this greening that we see in the satellite data set is not necessarily attributable to variations in climate over the last 30 years. So then we are forced to look for an answer somewhere else. And so there is the difficulty with detecting the trend itself in a convincing way. And of course, a more difficult problem is making the case for attribution. So these are my thoughts. Like I said, my talk is short, and I'm done. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Ranga, for a nice opening talk and for leaving some problems to younger scientists. Yeah.
Nice talk. A couple of clarifications on what you mentioned. One is you mentioned Harvard Forest and the Oak Ridge site analysis regarding CO2 fertilization. As my understanding is that CO2 fertilization is having an impact on the phase project's CO2 productivity. But because of the nitrogen limitation, actually, you don't see the increase in the NPP. So the CO2 fertilization is there, but nitrogen interaction actually reduces the fertilization.
Yes, that is the general thinking. The reason why we may not be seeing CO2 fertilization in a lot of the experiments sustained for a long time could be because of nitrogen limitation. The ORNL and the Duke experiments results that I referred to come from a very recent paper in New Phytologist by Zongazawa. So
yes, I'm one of the authors on that paper.
Oh, okay. So you know what I'm talking about.
So one other clarification I would like to know about. because we have, the Moody's product for GPP. I was wondering, why didn't you compare your product, with the Moody's GPP product?
Yeah, good question. Actually, we are doing that, and well, the royal we is Jaichun doing that. But right now, as I speak, Jaichun is enjoying nuptial bliss and lunar holiday in China. So when he finally comes back, that's the thing we want to do. We know that it's 15 years only, the Moody's data set. It's a very short time period, but it's worthwhile checking it out, and we will do that.
So coming back to the face experiment, sort of implying that the CO2 fertilization is causing it. The face experiment is completely different forcing to this long-term trend, and it strikes me that it's likely that they may well produce completely different results, given that the face experiment was an instantaneous massive increase in CO2, and this is a long-term EPO. It might not have hit the nitrogen in many places yet. So I'm not sure. I'm not saying it is a CO2, but I'm not sure that's the argument why it's not.
Yeah. There is some partial support in a paper recently published that reported the increasing amplitude in the seasonal CO2 cycle at Point Barrow. Especially if that increase in amplitude can be traced to or said to be due to a similar trend in the downward limb of the seasonal cycle. But then again, that's only mid-latitude forests and above. Now I'm talking entire globe is showing this, so we need some sort of independent confirmation.
Peter? Just to say, that does look to be the case. I think that you're seeing a growing of the depth of the minimum of the drawdown in CO2 over time. That wasn't the question I was going to ask, though. I was curious about the relationship between the increase you've got in GPP, and presumably can comment on the increase in NPP, and the trend or the structure of the terrestrial sink over time. I'm struggling to get the back of the envelope calculation, but it looks like your number would suggest a larger increase in the sink than we actually see from the residual in the atmosphere. Have you done that comparison?
No. I'm working with the vegetation index, and I'm okay with making the assumption that it is proxying GPP, but no more of the carbon cycle. Just the GPP.
Yeah, I was just thinking about using GPP as an input and using simple residence time calculation and seeing what you'd expect for the overall sink.
Yeah.
But perhaps we should talk offline.
Yeah.
Ranga, I also have a question myself on the plot you showed with increasing green trend over the last decades as well, while we know that global warming slowed down during that period. Do we see a sort of decoupling between green trend and warming?
I don't know how to answer that question. Because in areas where, when you talk about the hiatus in global warming, you're talking about the annual average global temperature. And that's not necessarily seen, let's say, if you were to look in a certain region, like in the northerly latitudes, during the springtime period, for instance. But I haven't done that kind of analysis.
Yeah, one of the features of this last decade was that in Siberia there was almost no increase in temperature during the summer over the last 10 years, so while the data you showed indicate a green trend, so that's why I was curious.
There is analysis by Shailong Piao that shows that the sensitivity to temperature is decreasing in the northern latitudes. He's publishing that now.
I was wondering, you talked about a new GIMS dataset. Does this dataset differ in any way from the old one? Because I think the old one, there was some deviations from MODIS from 2001 or 2 onwards.
Yes.
For example, in the Tibetan plateaus?
Yeah, the old data set is called NDVI-G for first generation. And that data set runs from 1981 to 2006 or 2008, depending on from whom you get the data set. But that data set is corrupted from 2000 on. This is a new data set, which is quite good. I wanted to hear Peter's comment again about the seasonal cycle at Point Barrow.
Do you want to reply from Peter?
No, I want to hear his comment about the seasonal cycle at amplitude at Point Barrow.
It's not so much from Point Barrow, I've done the analysis, but just looking at the inversion results, the seasonality of atmospheric inversions over the last 20 plus years, there's evidence of an increasing depth in the inverse estimates of the seasonal flux. So that's more a hemispheric scale, or northern extratropics scale. So that would be consistent with what you're seeing, I think.
Thank you.
I'd like to ask if anybody's, it wasn't all greening up, some of it in fact was browning, and there's areas in Canada, for instance, that were browning. Is anybody analysing that, and would that give some clues into the attribution?
Like I said, this is the new data set, and so in this data set we only see 2% of the vegetated area showing a statistically significant decrease in this particular variable. And there are several papers in the special issue, and there will be talks today about the Sahel, and the speaker following myself will get into more detail. So, yeah.
Now the very last question.
I was wondering if you evaluated trends in phenology, the start of season or the length of season, and if you see they are consistent with the green trends.
No. I defined the growing season using the climatology of the data set. So my growing season, the beginning and the end, at any location is not interannually varying.
Okay, thank you, Rami.